For one more thing, so the top 100 best brands in Africa were announced at a ceremony hosted at the JSC at the weekend. Sports and fitness brand Nike came out tops at number one, with telecommunications company MTN being recognized as one of the most admired brands in Africa. Now, the Brand Africa 100 ranking is based on a survey that's conducted in 23 countries across the continent. It revealed that African brands account for 17% of the top 100 brands on the continent, but non-African brands have retained their number one position in Africa with 83% share of the top 100 most admired brands. So to talk to us more about these rankings, I'm now joined by brand leadership CEO Thebe Ikalafeng, as well as Charles Foster, who is the CEO for Africa and the Middle East at Kantar. Thanks so much to both of you for coming through.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Why is it important to keep track of these brands and how they perform on the continent?
Well, it's important because when brands are doing well in the continent, it means we are creating jobs. It means we are creating revenues which will fund public goods. But most important is that we are creating a favorable image about the continent, about Africa's entrepreneurship, Africa's ability to create to the rest of the world. It's an inspiration to the world. And I must say, you know, when you open to those numbers and say, that's what we were. We have faltered since then. So this year, we're now down to 86% of the brands that which are non-African, and only 14% of the brands that Africans admire are African. So we faltered a little bit this year.
Well, which isn't terribly fantastic, and I'm trying to be as nice as possible about this, Charles. But why is that?
Well, ultimately, there is enormous pressures on Africa brands like every other brand around the world, and it has to be said, the big wide world is out there thundering very hard. The techno companies are spending enormous amounts of money, the luxury brands are spending enormously, and indeed that is reflected in many of the top ratings for brands in Africa. Ultimately, we cannot exclude the outside world when we try and market to Africans in Africa, and I'm afraid the big wide world can fight extremely hard, and they have made some major inroads without question and continue to do so. So yes, where we are fighting a big battle.
So what are they doing that African brands are not doing?
Well, first they've got, there's a legacy. They've been here much longer. They've got the resources, they've got the reach, the scale, so economies of scale are easy for them, but most importantly, they've got the money to invest in building the brands. And they've got the ability, the craft. We get in there as well. I mean, if you look at the likes of Dangote, which is the number one most admired African brand, when you ask consumers to specifically highlight an African brand, and you look at the likes of MTN, which is the number one most admired African brand, if you don't ask them about the geography, so it's spontaneously recall. So the two brands show you that we can stand head to head with any brand in the world.
And then, of course, Anbesa, an apparel company from Ethiopia. And I was quite ashamed that I had never heard of them. I'm totally oblivious to who they are.
You know, the first
many haven't. Yes,
the first time this brand has been appearing on the list for many years now. We've been doing this survey now since 2011, and this is the seventh installment in that period. And Anbesa's always been there. Now, if you get to travel in the East African region and all the current countries surrounding it, you get to understand that this is one of Ethiopia's most strongest brands, perhaps one of the best known brands in Ethiopia, which has spilled over to the other countries around it. So yes, the beauty about why we do this as well is to be able to also unearth those brands that many of us don't know. So fortunately for me, I've been to every country in the continent, so that allows me, have given me the advantage of being able to see a real life where these brands are, when they're coming from. So in many ways, to be able to validate what we see there and what we see here.
And certainly very interesting. But just finally, Charles, perhaps a word of advice for African brands. What can they do to make sure that hopefully at some point we displace these international brands?
There's no question we have it in us. There's enormous entrepreneurial spirit within Africa. We've seen time and again they're able to overcome all obstacles, and I have no doubt that we will continue to fight the good fight and start to see some really major African brands appearing on this list.
Indeed. If you have the time, I would suggest you go and take a look and to see how African brands are faring and who the top ones are. But thanks so much to Thebe Ikalafeng, and of course also to Charles Foster for stopping by this morning, just giving us a sneak preview of what those brands are and the ones that are performing best. So with that, let's take a quick break.